Okay. I had shown a little clip of that little Harley, and I mentioned I was going to go into that more, which I will, but it's a very involved story how they came to be. And I think before I go into that particular bike or that particular model, I want to actually give you a little background on that, on the whole story with those little two-stroke singles that Harley was putting out. It starts out in Germany before the war, like a lot of stories do. DKW, a German manufacturer, was making a great little 125 two-stroke bike, way ahead of its time. Efficient, economical, just a good all-around basic transportation motorcycle. And they sold well on a civilian market. Not fancy. They had like a rigid frame. I mean, no rear suspension. Up front was like a stamped steel girder system. I believe they had springs on theirs. But great little bike. Well, when the war broke out, they started using them in the military. They were great dispatch, messenger, scouting thing, so they used them a lot. And there was all kinds of stuff they hung on them. But after the war, as part of the war reparations, this was a thing that they did a lot of. A lot of things that the Germans had ended up, that they had developed, ended up going to other countries. Like our whole missile program, our whole space program really came from the Germans. But there was a lot of stuff in the weapons and manufacturing that was part of the reparations. Part of this was they lost their patent, so to speak, on that motor design, on that whole motorcycle. Yeah, DKW RT 125. Like I say, great bike. But when they lost their monopoly on these, it kind of got to be public domain. So anybody could build these. Or there was also the option where there were some countries that bought the motors from DKW, and then they would build their own frames and design them how they wanted, but use the actual motor. But there's a lot of countries, the blueprints were there, so they just made them themselves. In fact, it's kind of funny, they were all over the world, like third world countries and everything. These motorcycles actually started that small motorcycle industry. A lot of companies who had never made motorcycles before, all of a sudden, here they had everything they needed, all the engineering. If they had the ability to manufacture, they would start making them. It's actually how Yamaha got into business. That is the RA1. Let's see if you can. No, I ain't going to be able to show you. You can look it up. But it's the first Yamaha, 1955. Called a Red Dragonfly. but it is a copy of that RT 125 that DKW was making. You know, they just re-engineered it. The most the most unusual re-engineering job was BSA in England made use of that. But the shift is on the left-hand side on the original, well, and the Brits wanted it on the other side, so they actually created a mirror image of the blueprint to move the shift to the right-hand side. But otherwise, it's the same bike. It's just, like I said, a reflection of it. But these things, this design was all over the place. And eventually Harley ended up with it too. But, let's see, there's a list here. Yeah, the English Bantam. The Soviets made a Moscova, which was, you know, a copy. The Italians made one. NSU made one. But a lot of different countries. It's amazing how many people use that same design. There was a lot of Italians that used it. The first Kawasaki motorcycle was a copy of it, just like what the Yamaha one was. There's even a Norwegian one. Czech, Hungarian, you know, I mean, they just, it was a really good design, and like I say, it was now in a public domain, so everybody was making them. But that's where the Harley angle comes in. Because Harley didn't have a small bike, you know, Harley, they had their 45s, but to get a small, you know, people at that time were looking for cheap transportation. So Harley started making these 125s. And the first one that Harley, you know, people refer to them as a Hummer, but the first ones weren't, they were an S125. They evolved into being a Hummer later, but for the first few years they were just that S125. And I think, I know my brother has one that's disassembled, and I'll see if I can't pull some parts to show you some differences on that. A rare thing you don't see very often anymore. I ran into these the other day, the stubby millers. Okay, the Harley one, when Harley started building them, 47, 48, and I think the one that my brother has up, you know, taken apart, is actually right in one of the first ones. It's really amazing, but that had the girder type front end, rigid frame. You know, it was the 125, 3-speed, like 3 horsepower, top speed, like 50 miles an hour. But the girder front end on that, instead of springs, it actually, for the suspension, it had rubber bands. Well, not the best, it was better than nothing, evidently, but, you know, like I say, the DKW, they had used springs in them. But on these Harleys, the seat was your rear suspension, and you really, all you had was them rubber bands to give you a little bit in the front. And evidently they broke all the time, and they quit making them. And but Harley went to the telescoping front end then, the Teleglide. And that's what the Hummers ended up, you know, the one, I learned to ride on a Hummer that a neighbor had, and it had the telescoping front end. But That it was a weird bike that the neighbor had, because it was one that had been a Shriner bike. They had used it in parades and doing their little riding around, and it had all kinds of weird goodies on it when he got it. I mean, it had like these odd little flashlights that were on the spokes, so that when you drove it, the lights would flash, you know, stuff like that, and a big chrome fishtail exhaust, and it was really fancied up, you know, and that was actually a Hummer at that time. But still a rigid frame, but at least telescoping front end, you know, so you had some suspension there. And that had, instead of the single seat that most of them had, that actually had a dual seat. And I think that was maybe not the 125, that might have already been in the 165, because they actually bumped them up to the 165 rather quickly because they were a little underpowered. But they were popular and they sold well. You know, it took off slow, but it picked up quite a little, the sales on them, because they were relatively cheap. I've seen, what was that price, like $250 or some such thing. You know, well, that was great. You know, I used to see ads in, you know, I've got a bunch of like old Popular Mechanics and Mechanics Illustrated. You know, like here's an old pouring up one, but I bet you if I look through here, I would find an ad for Harley Davidson, because they used to really push, you know, and once they had that Hummer, then they had well, here's an ad for a Whizzer, but everyone, there was always an ad for Harleys in here, and once they had that Hummer, you know, here's where the Model K, the first Sportster that came out, which was a great Sportster, but, you know, that's as small as they had. You know, so, you know, that and the 45, and the Sportster was kind of a dirt bike in theory at that time. Yeah, new powerful 45 cubic inch. But they were heavy for a dirt bike, you know. I don't know what year this magazine is. 1952. This one's taking quite a beating, but they used to sell a lot of them, of the Hummers. But it didn't last. Like this thing, the Scat is what it was called, that my brother has, that I showed the other day. That kind of evolved from the Hummer, but it's not really a Hummer. You know, it's the same motor design, but like I say, it was increased in horsepower. And, you know, they went from the 50 miles an hour up to, on a good day, you could go 70, you know. And to have the actual telescoping front end. But they were still rigid frame for a long time. Now that changed on that one that my brother has. That actually has some rear suspension. Not much, but there's some there. And that's one of the interesting things about that model that I'll show you. You know, it's funny when Harley came out with the soft tail, you know, that looks like a rigid, but it's not. That wasn't new. That was being used on that Scat. But of them, you know, these were American made, but using that German design. I wish they would have developed that line further, but eventually they started getting more involved in the Italians, you know, and they started importing the Sprint models. that were made in Italy, and that never really flew. They were nice. I mean, the Sprints are nice. Single cylinder, but it's like a horizontal cylinder. So they worked really well because you have a very low center of gravity, and they handle like a dream. You know, they're great bikes, but they weren't really Harley. So that didn't really work out so well. But they're on their own, as for what they are. They're a fantastic little motorcycle. They're fun to run. You know, the handling on them is just excellent. But I would have liked to see Harley go a different direction. But Harley had a history of making bad decisions. You know, whenever there came up, they had to make a choice. They always made a bad choice. You know, starting in like the 60s, late 50s, 60s, Harley went in weird directions. And they've continued to do that. I mean, a lot of the stuff now, I've seen some interesting bikes that Harley's making, but they're being made like in India and stuff. I kind of lost interest in what they're doing now. Interesting that the Yamaha with that Red Dragonfly, they actually considered remaking that a kind of a tribute model to that. But that was back in 2011. I haven't heard any more of that. But that was an interesting idea. The concept was interesting. There again, small, light bike, but they were going to go with a 4-stroke motor, slightly bigger. You know, that's an interesting thing too. Like Honda is one of the few companies that didn't get involved in that German design. Honda did make their first motorcycle was like a 98cc 2-stroke. But they got away from that rather quickly. They went to 4-strokes because they didn't, like in the crowded cities and stuff, these screaming little 2-strokes. Honda really didn't particularly like 2-strokes. They wanted to go with 4-strokes, so that's what they did. It wasn't until much later when they came out with the Elsinore that they actually were willing to go back into the 2-stroke market. But a lot of people started out, a lot of companies, almost all of them except for Honda, started out using that basic German design of that R1 or RT 125. There's a lot of information on that whole development, but that is where a lot of manufacturers got started, because anybody could pick it up. You know, it was there for the asking. And beautiful bikes. You know, I really, even today, like say that Yamaha, you know, rather than they want to make they were talking making a tribute bike to that, but more modern. I'd love if they'd make just what they had. What they had was a beautiful bike. You know, I can't see having to go modernize something, but something is that good. You know, like say this RT 125 that Germany was making was developed in the 30s, and this basic design was used up in the 60s. I mean, that's a long run for a design, but like I said, they were ahead of their time. Now, the thing about this one that my brother has, well, hopefully I can show you the differences between the original Hummer. You know, because we really should start assembling that original Hummer. But the differences between that and the Scat was designed for sportsmen. It was made so that you could get out in the woods, you know, strap on a gun and drive back where nobody else was. it was like the first dirt bike, you know, made for off-road use. It came with knobby tires, and that's why it has the up exhaust. Everything else had the exhaust down low. This, they put the exhaust up for clearance. But that's why they needed to have some rear suspension too, because otherwise, you know, you're going on back trails. But nobody else was making dirt bikes at that time. And it's kind of cool. You see the advertisements for it, you know, and it'll show a guy, you know, driving back in the woods with his rifle strapped out his back. But that's what they were made for. But to find one, that particular one, is in such excellent shape, it's just incredible. It hasn't been monkeyed with, and that is rare. You know, usually somebody's got to fiddle with stuff, but the guy he bought it from, it had been his brother's, you know, and his brother had died, and so he was stuck with this old motorcycle, and so it was a good find. But I'll have to, if I can show you some of the parts of that original Hummer, that was something else. You know, that, I need to look at that serial number again, because I looked at it one time, but I can't remember. I thought it was a 47, but it might be a 48, because they started making them at 47, but there wasn't a lot of them out until 48, so I don't know. You know, I like I say, I have to look at the serial number again. But, you know, that when somebody had made in the comments in that other video, they said, you know, it's just an Italian two-stroke. Nah, they're way more than that. They're a whole different thing. They were actually a very important part of the motorcycle history, the history of the industry. They really started it, of the small bike thing, you know. But like I say, Harley had a habit of making bad decisions. I don't know why, but I'll go into it someday. You know, I'll go over there and hopefully we can get together some of the parts from that old one, so I can show you the difference in them. Because it is derived from a Hummer, but it isn't. It is a Scat. But they made a lot of different models, clean up to like 66. I think is when they finally phased out that design. But up to that time, man, they would, some of them very limited production. You know, there's all kinds of weird names. It's actually kind of hard to find information on them, and confusing because there's just too many. You know, but they were trying to get into that small bike market. But when they kind of failed, then the Japanese took over, and that was the end of that game. You know, I mean, Harley later got, after their fiasco with the Sprints, which really didn't work out, though, like I said, excellent motorcycle, they did get into a different two-stroke line in the 70s, again Italian, but they were kind of a shoddily built thing. So that didn't really fly. But those old Hummers and the descendants of the Hummers are fantastic machines. You just don't see them very often anymore, and a little hard to get parts for. You know, like that one that's got the rubber band suspension. I don't know what the hell we're going to do. I think maybe a guy could use pieces off a radiator hose. It probably wouldn't have a lot of give, but I think you could cut bands to make that work. But one of these days I'll go down there when it's warmer and I'll give you a closer look at the design on that thing. I was lucky looking on eBay. I was able to find a couple parts that were missing off that, like a new Kickstarter rubber and a brand new owner's manual for it, which was a good find. Because there's some things about that are a little mysterious. And I've worked on Harleys, but that particular model is kind of new to me. But good design, and I look forward to fiddling around with that thing. I wish that was mine. It belongs to my brother, but I would like to have one of them, though they do go pretty high. You know, you're looking, you can get up for a really restored one is like $8,000, but I think nowadays it seems to me that any motorcycle seems to cost a hell of a lot of money, so I don't. But I could see somebody putting out money for one of them, though I would love to see Yamaha remake that version that they had. That was a great bike. Beautiful looking bike. A little more refined than what, the Hummer was a pretty plain Jane thing, the first ones. Yamaha kind of classed it up a little. And some of the Italian ones, they classed up quite a little too, when they were making versions of it. It'd be interesting to see the Soviet one. I haven't seen that, but they're all use that basic design, because if you can make something that is that reliable, there's no need to keep changing it, Yeah, that was a good find. And the odds are I never run into another one.